There appears to be a misconception when people study the New or Old Testament. For some reason, skeptics like to assume the historical fallacy, known as the argument from silence, is not fallacious as long as it applies to the Bible. I say this because I'm astonished by how many atheists attempt this argument and assume it actually works. Even in online debates I've engaged in, this argument comes up as a supposed credible argument in dismissing the New Testament. The argument usually goes like this. The New Testament documents mention things that are so unbelievable, so magnificent, that if they truly happened, other writers surely would have mentioned them. Therefore, because no one else actually does, they probably didn't happen and are just legends. Now, I highly doubt any skeptic would apply this criteria to the rest of ancient history, or realize that if they did, they would have to throw out most of it. Second, this is, as I've stated, an historical fallacy, known as an argument from silence. And an argument from silence is an informal fallacy and a type of argument from ignorance, where something mentioned in an historical document is assumed to be false because no other sources mention it. Now, an argument from silence is not when there are zero sources for something. Members of the King James Onlyist group love to make up the idea that there was this ancient Alexandrian cult that corrupted the New Testament. Well, we have zero sources for the existence of such a cult, and therefore it is not fallacious to point out they probably didn't exist, due to lack of sources. An argument from silence is only a fallacy if one dismisses a source that does record an event because other sources did not. For example, one could use the fallacy to say, Josephus mentions how Herod Archelaus slaughtered several Jews in the temple and canceled Passover, yet no other source mentions this horrific event. Therefore, Josephus simply fabricated the whole event to make the descendants of Herod the Great look evil, who he didn't like. If you think about this for a second, you'll see the problem with it. Just because Tacitus or the Gospel writers didn't mention this event, that doesn't mean Josephus made it up. The silence of another doesn't prove Josephus fabricated it. Yet when skeptics apply this to the Gospels, for some reason, it seems perfectly reasonable to conclude they fabricated events about Jesus. Some reply the events surrounding Jesus were so fantastic, they would have to have been spread around and mentioned by others. Well, Herod Archelaus slaughtering Jews in a sacred temple, canceling Passover, and effectively sending hundreds of thousands of Jews back home across the empire can easily be argued that it affected far more people and would have burned a lasting effect on hundreds of thousands of them. Yet only Josephus mentions this. Why no one else? Another good example can be seen in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. This was one of the biggest and most devastating disasters from the ancient Roman Empire. 2 cities were completely destroyed in the eruption. The death toll estimated by scholars is somewhere between 16 to 60,000, and many of these people were of the wealthy and educated upper class. The eruption would have been seen by many more people, estimating around 250,000. Yet how many sources do we have which report this event? Well, not many. In fact, we only have one. And it isn't even contemporary. It was written 30 years after, and not in a book of history, but a private letter from Pliny the Younger to Tacitus. The only reason it was noted is that Pliny the Younger's uncle died in the eruption. If his uncle did not, we may have ended up with zero sources about this catastrophic event. And remember, this eruption would have affected far more people, wealthy and educated people as well, than the deeds of one Jewish rabbi, primarily speaking to uneducated peasants in a small backwater province of Rome. In fact, we could point to examples all day, like how we have no Carthaginian or contemporary sources for Hannibal, no sources for Alexander the Great until over 350 years after he existed. Marco Polo, in his documentation of China, never mentions the Great Wall of China. Ulysses S. Grant wrote a diary of the American Civil War, but never mentions the Emancipation Proclamation. As you can see, we can find many omissions from far more recent times. But their omission doesn't mean they didn't think such things or people existed. So why all the silence anyway? Well, there are several factors we need to remember when studying ancient history. The first being the amount of people that could read and write. Today we are used to a culture where everyone can at least read and write, but for the ancient world, such an ability required education, which not everyone could readily afford. So as little as 1 in 10 people could actually read and write. And in even poorer regions, that could drop to as little as 1 in 20. That limits the amount of people that could actually record events for us. A second limitation is something we touched on in a previous video, which is the cost of writing. As we said before, papyrus and ink 2,000 years ago was not cheap, like it would be today. To copy and preserve a document was an expensive endeavor. A papyrus the size of Mark's Gospel, or 1 Corinthians, would cost roughly 2 denarii, and a day's wage was 1 denarii, if you were lucky. So to obtain the money for just one papyrus, you would need to work at least 2 full days, and possibly more. Something for the size of Luke or Matthew would cost about 5 denarii. Then that doesn't include ink or the time it takes to write. There were no comfy chairs, and to much of our surprise, no one really figured out they could use a table to write on in the ancient world. So scribes resorted to writing on their laps or on the floor, which is not exactly the most comfortable thing to do for hours. While of course you write with a quill and ink. So not only did people need to be educated, but also wealthy enough to afford writing material. But they would also need to care enough to actually spend the time and money to record an event. If it didn't matter to them, why would they go through such lengths to record events about, say, a Jewish rabbi executed as a criminal they didn't even believe in? Also for ancient historians, the recording of history was not primarily for the recording of astonishing events, like it was a profession of Ripley's Believe It or Not. The recording of history was more of a practical application for their contemporary audiences. Tacitus didn't want to know about Pliny the Younger's uncle to know how amazing the eruption was, but to hear about it so he could teach others about the honor of his uncle and to remember the man who died. Ancient writers were not modern writers, and they had different priorities. If they didn't feel such a thing was relevant or practical, they were unlikely to record it. This can help us understand how and why New Testament authors wrote about different events and focused on varying aspects. A common argument is, if such an event in Matthew was so miraculous, Luke would not have left it out. But depending on their intended audience, one author might decide to focus on certain things, whereas a different author, with a different audience, may feel it necessary to spend his time on different aspects. Excessive words that detracted from the message were to be avoided at all costs, literally. As Samuel Breisgog says, writers knew that certain matters had better not be included. One should avoid an excess of unnecessary facts and words. As a matter of course, a selection always took place on different levels of research and writing, such as when the historian chose what particular subject to investigate, or when circumstances forced him to leave out matters concerning which he could not receive sufficient information. This is compounded by the fact that a scroll was still an expensive commodity, and you had limited space to include everything you needed. That obviously meant some things would need to be left out. One gospel writer may feel it necessary to mention a certain story about Jesus for his audience, and another might feel it necessary to focus on other aspects. Their silence doesn't somehow mean a different gospel author, writing to a different audience, made it up. For example, Matthew mentions miracles that took place during the death of Jesus. This would have been relevant for his intended audience, being that he was writing for Jews throughout Judea. The other gospel writers were writing to people outside of Judea, and this fact would have been geographically irrelevant to them. So why bring it up and waste precious space if it had no practical purpose for your intended audience? Instead, you can focus on other aspects of Jesus that you think your intended audience could use or find more relevance to. As you should expect, the same thing happened in secular history as well. Breisgog notes the Hellenica Oxarchatia focuses highly on the naval war of 396 BC, while Xenophon only mentions it briefly as a stir at Sparta during the winter. Perhaps we could say this epic naval battle is just a legend since Xenophon didn't mention it. These are the kind of conundrums we fall into when we apply the skeptic standard of how they read the Gospels to the rest of ancient history. Another thing to consider is the biblical world's use of silence. A lot of times writers didn't mention their religious or political opponents as a way to shame them, as if they were saying they were not valuable enough to be mentioned in the records. Outside of the circles of Christians, secular or Jewish authors would not care or like Jesus enough to mention his deeds. And if he did make a big enough mark, the key would be to only mention him briefly, to not make it seem like he was very important. It is sort of like today, where we recognize that even bad news can be good, as it gets your name out. Parallels to this can be seen in Israel's neighbor of Egypt, where if pharaohs didn't like the previous rulers, they would attempt to blot him out of history. The same thing would apply to the biblical world where the Christian opponents would not seek to honor Jesus by affirming his miracles or resurrection. I mean, why would they care to mention his miracles if they didn't believe in him to begin with? That should be common sense, which is why we should expect Christian opponents to not mention the great deeds of Jesus or only briefly mention a little if necessary in talking about something else that's related. but not try to give him too much honor or affirm his divinity. I mean, what are modern skeptics expecting ancient non-believers to do? So not only did people need to be educated, wealthy, care enough to write, but if they were opponents, they would have had desires to not propagate the miracles and deeds of a rabbi they didn't respect. So that really limits the amount of secular writers who could record events about Jesus. But let's also remember how many writings from the first century have survived. Christ mythers in particular love this argument from silence and often mention that Jesus is not mentioned in Pilate's or Roman records. Well, if they did an ounce of research, they would know we don't know if he is or not, because Pilate's records were lost to history and don't exist anymore. In fact, we have lost most of what would have been written in the ancient world, simply because records were not made to last 2,000 years. They were made to last more like 200, if you were lucky. In reality, we are lucky if we have enough books from the first century to fill a few bookshelves. If we got all the writings we have left over from the first century, we could maybe fill up 4 shelves total. And none of those would even be original documents, but copies of them from later centuries. So perhaps there were more mentions of Christ in the ancient world, but we simply do not have them anymore. So of course we would expect a lot of silence from the ancient world. Wouldn't you if most of your documents were lost to time? We are lucky we have so many secular mentions of Christ as it is. But add to that how modern skeptics have just set up a no-win situation for Christians. They tell us, unless we can find a secular author to mention Jesus' miracles, divinity, and resurrection, there is no reason to believe it is historically reliable. But if an ancient author had recorded that these things truly did happen, that would have made them a Christian convert, and then the skeptics would simply dismiss them as such and as unreliable. It is a no-win situation and a self-defeating circle. Give us a secular author that mentions Jesus' resurrection. Well, if they believed it was true, they would have been a Christian for affirming the resurrection. Therefore, of course Christians would say that, so we'll dismiss it as unreliable until a secular author admits it is true. So in reality, when skeptics try this argument, they are just admitting they don't want to accept the claims of Jesus because it doesn't agree with their worldview, not because they have actually looked at the evidence objectively. Nor does this attempt to use an argument from silence actually refute the claims of the Gospels. It fails on all accounts. So arguments from silence? Yeah, they don't work. If any skeptic tries to throw this out at you, it is a pretty clear sign they have never read any ancient history. And start asking them if they apply this criteria to Hannibal, Alexander the Great, or Josephus. 99% of the time, it'll be pretty clear they do not, and it will reveal how fallacious their reasoning is.